Welcome. It's so great to have you here taking this class. This is a class that I've been planning for a really, really long time, and I am super excited that we've got a reasonably sized group to do it with. This first lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about Dark Times Academy for those of you who don't know us, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the class, and then we're going to get right into it. So to sort of start, I'm Mandy. I was a librarian for 20 years, and then I ran an NGO called Toa Toha. And then once we sort of lost funding for that org, my friend Byron Clark and I started Dark Times Academy, and we offer community education classes using a Zoom platform and sort of this motto where we send a lecture and then we all get together and talk. So that's sort of who we are. Happy to answer more questions. The main thing to know is that we don't have any sort of like secret institutional support or anything. It's just me and Byron. But it's great. He's got amazing IT skills in terms of running our infrastructure. And I am reasonably good at the sort of organizational parts of it. We do have Moodle, so I hadn't really decided for this class whether or not we would use Moodle. I thought that would be something that we could talk about together. Given the nature of it, maybe there's some other way that we want to try and share materials with each other. So let's talk about that once we get together in class. So this class is going to explore questions of why and whether decomputing is a good and reasonable answer to the current various troubles that we're all having around the world, both the far right turn, the rise of artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI, but also algorithmic AI. We're going to work to come up with a definition of decomputing and sort of figure out what the heck it even is. It's not an idea that has a sort of strong line of theory behind it, but there is an enormous range of and sort of history around objections to computing, sort of anti-computing discourse. So we're going to work to understand those a little bit better, as well as do some sort of practical questions around what does decomputing mean for our daily lives? What does it mean for our professional lives? How would we even do it if we decided it's what we wanted to do? The class, I'm hoping, will be collaborative and co-created. I think that as a group, we're going to have to feel our way around this sort of concept and practice together, rather than me sort of claiming to come in with any kind of answers. I don't think there are answers to this yet, if it is even possible to get answers. So as part of this, what I was thinking is that we would do activities that we would discuss and agree on for class. Things like, bring an article about X, all the way to like, what if we wrote and mailed a letter that we put like a stamp on, to sort of start exercising some of those muscles that maybe some of us have let atrophy, or maybe we never really had. So I'm going to do my best to send out a lecture and readings before class each week with enough time for you to review them, but like, don't feel bad if you don't get to them. I will highlight anything that you should review before class. Also, as I mentioned, I'm a librarian, so I do get a little carried away with bibliography sometimes. View those as like suggestions and highlighted resources rather than like a reading list for you to sit down and seriously read all the way through. I mean, definitely do if you want to, but don't feel at all obligated to. A lot of what I'm doing is just sort of highlighting. Often it will be sort of classic and important, either sort of historical or just really important resources that you should know about, but that doesn't mean you have to read them now. If there's something that we're going to be talking about specifically in class, I will let you know so that we'll give you a chance to figure out that you should probably take a look at that if you get time. Never don't come to class because you didn't do the reading or didn't watch the lecture. Like, it's totally cool to just show up as you are. All of the material is going to be available to you on Moodle or on whatever platform we decide going forward. So like, there's no need to sort of eat it all quickly because it's going to be there for you. And the most important thing is that we get together and we have a chance to build community and explore this idea of decomputing. We are also timed, if we wish to be a node for the Computing Within Limits conference. It's called the Limits 2025. We can talk about that more in class if that's something that we're interested in pursuing, or if that's not really something that we want to do as part of this class. but I did time the class so that it would be an option. And I've chatted with the folks at Limits 2025, and they seem really awesome. So I'm going to get right into it now. Decomputing, sort of where I thought I was going to start, was sort of with the idea of decomputing, which is something that is talked about. You can search for it, but it's really a fairly new idea. And it's not an idea that I would describe as robustly researched. However, there is a really long strand of resistance to computing that runs across many different areas of human thought. So I thought that we would talk and think about those critiques for this first class. And then I got a little overwhelmed reading them. So I sort of backed up like Homer Simpson learning marketing style. And I was lucky enough to have a friend point me to the work of Caroline Bassett, and specifically her book, Anti-Computing: Dissent Against the Machine. So a lot of my lecture today is going to be based on her work, which I think is phenomenal. I've included a link to it in the list of resources that you got in your email. So in it, she lays out a taxonomy that I think is going to be really useful for us in our exploration of motives and methods to think about when considering decomputing and whether or not it's a useful personal and social action. So what I thought I would do is go ahead and share that taxonomy with you now. Of course, definitely read her book if you have time. It's open access, so super easy to get your hands on. So the first thing that she does when thinking about her taxonomy of computing resistance is she rejects this idea of a binary taxonomy that puts computing resistance into two categories. The first category that she sort of says people might be inclined to are ontological objections to computers. So objections about the thing that computers are in and of themselves. And then the second would be social and political economy objections. She argues that this is a false binary and that it's a binary that creates considerable room for mischief on the part of what I think in 2025 we could call tech oligarchs, as well as the companies that they run, by obscuring the mixing of ontological and social concerns and the obvious sort of tension between those two things. It's worth sort of noting that Bassett was writing in, well, the book was published in 2021. So really we're looking at a book that was probably written from like 2018, maybe 2019, sort of all the way through to 2020. So she was writing before I think it became blindingly obvious where this was leading. And I think as we sort of work through that taxonomy, some of that, inability to foretell the future is going to become clear. And we can talk about that a little bit at the end and hopefully in class, because I think that she has some pretty clear blind spots in this taxonomy that make a lot of sense if you consider when she was writing. So in place of this sort of false binary that she thinks that lots of folks are inclined to put computing resistance into, instead she proposes an 8-category taxonomy. And I thought it would be really good for us to talk this through and to sort of test it out a little bit, and explore whether or not we think it's a useful way for us to think about both sort of the contemporary discourse, but also our own personal views on technology and sort of why is it that we've even signed up for a class on decomputing? Why did I plan a class on decomputing? So I'm going to go through that now. So the first category that she identifies is computing technology as control. So the totalizing power of the state and corporate actors, the ability of computers to enhance and increase social control, power, domination, and the fear of sort of ceding that control over to computers, and presumably the people who create those computers, right? She says that this sort of objection can come from both the left and the right of the political spectrum. And if you look through the reading list I sent, the James Benninger stuff, The Control Revolution, I think that if you look through chapters 6 and chapters 10, you can really see this sort of exemplified. And you can sort of really see, even as far back as the 80s, and I would argue even earlier going into the 50s, you see this kind of concern, right? The machine is going to create a totalitarian power of some sort, whether it's a government or a corporation. Uh, and that is going to obviously sort of create real harm for the rest of us who are sort of subjects of that power and control. So that's her first category. The second one that she talks about are concerns around computers displacing and replacing humans. So the replacement of human judgment and expertise, this idea that you might have a future where either there aren't humans or where humans are unrecognizable, the sort of rise of cyborg humans. And I think that this particular discourse, while it has fairly deep roots, I think that it's very, very of this particular moment. To sort of go back a few years, I think that a lot of Virginia Eubanks's work really sort of falls into this category where you're looking at algorithmic decision making and concerns around algorithmic decision making. But I think we also see it now in, for example, the discourse around the use of care robots for the elderly, which I know is something that is particularly talked about in Japan, but I think has also certainly been talked about in other parts of the world. And this sort of question of, right, like, is it morally wrong to have a robot performing those care tasks over a person? What is the actual job of a care worker? And do we think that a robot can in fact replace it? And another place where I think we see this discourse is around replica or character AI, particularly the replacement of you know, relationships between humans with AI romantic partners. So Replica, I think, is a company that does that. And there are fairly often stories on sort of what the people who choose to engage in romantic, I mean, I hate to use the term relationship, right? Because a relationship definitely implies a two-way street, but these sorts of simulacrum of relationships that are happening using these chatbots. And I think that we could fairly easily extend it to using physical representations of romantic partners as well. So the third category in her taxonomy is where she talks about the hollowing out of everyday life and social interaction, right? Sort of the focus on the embodied experience of being human and our relationships with each other. And she also puts attention concerns in here, sort of this idea that the way in which computers structure our time, the way in which, sort of constant notifications interrupt our day, she puts that into sort of this category. So if you think to it for a few years ago, remember when those Apple Watches first came out, and there was this sort of idea, and I think it is still pretty common in some areas, of sort of datafication of the self and sort of surveillance of the self, and this sort of relationship between your physical body and sort of converting it to a more datafied version of that. Um, the other sort of resistance that she cites in this category are the slow movement. So if you've ever heard of like the slow food movement, for example, and also the sorts of digital detox work that's been done. The digital detox sort of camps and sort of programs, she puts those into the sort of hollowing out of everyday life and social interaction category. I think that a lot of Jonathan Haidt's arguments can go there. And I think a fair number of Neil Postman, if you're familiar with his work, we'll probably get into that later in this class. I think some of that can fit really comfortably in here too, as well as can concerns about parasocial relationships on social media and this sort of relationship that influencers have to their followers that's not really sort of materially based, at least for the followers, though I think it is for the influencer. But they're somehow not real relationships. There's a fragility there that doesn't exist when people are interacting with our embodied selves in person. So the fourth one that she identifies are computing as a threat to human culture. And mind you, she is writing before the generative AI products started to come out for sort of at the consumer level. So she's writing in a pre-chat GPT era. And she identifies, threats to art, to story and narrative, to cinema. These sorts of fears that technocratic rationality and standardization and universalization of culture might end up somehow or other damaging I hate to call them the real things, but the sort of human created versions, right? The painter with a paintbrush, the potter at the wheel, the, writer at a typewriter or word processor, creating solely based on their own ideas as opposed to relying on technological tools. And I think it is very, very obvious that this particular idea is really heightened right now. Like this particular category is really, really heightened right now as generative AI has come to do real material damage to the world of art and of culture. When she sort of writes about this in her work, it's interesting. And this is one of the areas where I think, she might need to be updated a little bit here. And I think this is something we should talk about is she doesn't talk about computing as a threat to the sort of material conditions of artists and culture makers, right? When she's writing this, is thinking more in a sort of abstract sense, right? The computer could somehow or other create harm that is sort of a little bit vague. But I think that now that we've had the sort of rise of generative AI, it becomes really clear that these concerns are actually genuinely material, and material in ways that do represent a genuine threat. So it's sort of worth poking this one a little bit and sort of seeing whether or not this is a category that has sort of transformed out from under her taxonomy and whether the vaguer concerns that she identifies should be replaced with a category that really focuses on the material impact of, the rise of generative AI and this sort of ability of students, for example, to create, papers with the click of a button and, a few prompts. So the fifth category in her taxonomy is it's another one that I think is super interesting, and it's computing as catastrophic risk, right? So the emergence of an evil AI, genomic risk. So this idea that computers will somehow help us to create either a bioweapon or some sort of transformation in our genes that will transform humanity in some really terrible way. The sort of idea that excessive and unsustainable complexity could lead to a catastrophe. She puts environmental risks into this category. And I will say, I think that you see these kinds of arguments sometimes from degrowthers, but you also see them from the AI hype and sort of the folks who believe in the singularity and the sort of rise of an AI god. It's interesting because I think that this is a category where this is obviously still a really active part of our discourse. But if you're sort of looking at things in terms of how you position people sort of ideologically and on a political spectrum, the two sets of people who are sort of making it are way on the opposite end. But this is one of those areas where the right does tend to make these arguments in ways that perhaps overshadow those on the left who make these arguments. So 6 is the computing enabling bad people to do bad things, right? So the ways in which computing can distance people from accountability, encourage them to act in ways they would not otherwise act. So for example, being cruel online. She talks about the enabling of human degeneracy as sort of being a part of this. And what I think is really interesting is she describes this as being an illiberal objection to computers. And one of the things that I think has become much more apparent since she was writing this is the way in which the far right have enabled or have used computing as an organizing tool and have sort of relied on social media in order to build what has been, while a morally horrific movement, a nonetheless practically very successful movement. So I understand her criticism, right, that this is an illiberal objection, but I think that a lot of anti-fascist critiques, including my own, of computing really do also fall into that category. And I'm totally happy to be called illiberal, but I don't think the kind of person who thinks like me and who shares my views is really what she was initially thinking of when she sort of was laying out this taxonomy. And so 7 would be concerns around the impact of objectification and quantification on human society and humans. So if you've read the Feminist Manifesto, which I think I've included a link to in your readings, I think that is a really good example of sort of this category. Though I think this one also that one can also fall into the next category. There's a lot of sort of room for different arguments from this taxonomy in a single document. So, but concerns around the objectification and quantification of human society and humans, this idea that you're replacing human judgment with computer solutions, standardization, uniformity, the sort of she talks about the ironing out of exception. So this idea that you need everything uniform and standardized in order to be understood by the computer. And I think anyone who's ever had an interaction with WINS or another social welfare agency is well aware of what this looks like and well aware of sort of how this concern plays out on a really practical level. She also puts managerialism and metrification into this category. So this sort of reducing people to numbers, management by numbers. I think that when people talk about being data driven, like for me at least, I get just an ick around that. And I think that sort of ick that I'm feeling probably fits into this part of her taxonomy. And so 8, the final part of her taxonomy, is she talks about information overload, sort of datafication, sciencism, this idea of the decline of doing sort of analysis in favor of the creation of ever more data, concerns around big data. And I think you could very easily put the Feminist Manifesto into this category as well. So it's something that I think was really, really prevalent back in when she was writing this in like 2018 to 2021. I think we hear less about big data now, largely because I think that we're now to the point where rather than talking about big data, we're talking about generative AI, which is, of course, a thing that big data enabled. So we've almost sort of progressed along a sort of pathway from the sort of concept of big data and talking about that as like, what are they going to do with it? And now we know what they're going to do with it. So that's sort of the 8 category taxonomy that she lays out. And I thought it would be really good for us to have an opportunity to sort of have this kind of structure to think through what it is about technology that would even cause us to think that we want to do decomputing, what it is that maybe other people are thinking about that might lead them to have concerns that would want them to decompute. And then maybe we can sort of start getting into more of the practical stuff. All of that said, I think she misses some really important things in this taxonomy that we should talk about as a class. So number one, I think that she misses data and computing as imperialism and colonialism. She never talks about sort of colonialism at all in this chapter. And I think that there's a very clear strand of the discourse where fundamentally the objection to technology is about imperialism. It is about colonialism. And I think that that should be a part of this taxonomy. The work of Temeno Runga here in New Zealand around data sovereignty, those sorts of folks are where I would put them into this category in her taxonomy, which we've now just altered. And so the second one that I thought we could talk about that I don't think is really very well recognized in here, though she does sort of talk about it when she talks about computers enabling people to do bad things. So the 6th item there. But the rise of the far right and that coming out of Silicon Valley, sort of, if you look at Gamergate, maybe as the start of that, all the way to where we are now, where Elon Musk is going to cabinet meetings and running Doge. I think that while you can fit this into her sort of computers doing bad things, you can sort of, there are bits of it that you can pull out of the taxonomy. I think that that is worthy of its own particular category. And I would almost sort of call them anti-fascist objections. I think that because those have become such a feature, because the sort of rise of fascism is such a feature of our current historical period, and is really sort of the defining reality for a lot of us around the world right now, it warrants its own clear place in the taxonomy. So I'm really curious, sort of what you think, right? What do you think she's left out? What do you think she's done really well here? And when we get together, what I thought might be fun. So a taxonomy like this, a sort of, theoretical framework to think about something, is really only useful if it helps us to understand something else better. So what I thought we would do for the class, we'll do a whole bunch of other stuff too, but is look at the Wendell-Berry and Ursula Le Guin pieces that I've sent through. They're both fairly short. That Wendell-Berry piece is almost a sort of classic of anti-computing thought, though it's one that has received a considerable amount of criticism. We can talk about that as well. The why I will not buy a computer piece. And see how well this framework works for us as an analytical tool, right? As we're reading those pieces, does it make it easier for us to understand the arguments that are being made by Berry and Le Guin? Are there arguments that Berry and Le Guin are making that we can't quite place in the taxonomy? And then we can sort of talk about whether this is something useful for us as we go on, or whether there are others who have better taxonomies that maybe you know about that I'm not aware of, or whether we want to start building our own. Because I think the thing with decomputing is that if we want to make it more than like a set of personal choices that we're making, it's something that we need to be able to articulate to a larger audience. And to people who might also have these concerns, but maybe haven't been able to sort of catalyze them into action yet. And I think that a taxonomy is a really good way of helping us do the underlying theoretical work if we want to pull others along with us. So thank you so much. I cannot tell you how incredibly excited I am for this class and how glad I am that you signed up. And I really, really look forward to meeting you all next week. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everyone. And now, there we go.